Hey, so glad you got here. We were totally waiting for you, just about to listen to a story. Tonight's tale drifts in on the cool evening air, carrying the smell of fresh bread, damp earth, distant chimney smoke, and the comforting sound of voices winding down after a long day's work. It is the sort of evening where even the crows seem too relaxed to argue, and where every footstep along a country road feels like it already belongs to a story worth telling. If you've ever wondered what peace might have sounded like centuries ago, well, you're in exactly the right place. There may be a few unexpected smiles along the way too, because medieval life had an odd talent for making the ordinary feel surprisingly entertaining. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what the local time is where you are. There's something comforting about imagining people from all over the world sharing the same quiet story together. Now settle in, get comfortable, and just relax. Today's tale starts like this. There was once a man named Aldrin who knew the roads better than many people knew the rooms of their own homes. Years of wandering had taught him which hills echoed after rain, which bridges creaked in winter, and which villages baked the finest rye loaves. He had also learned that every road eventually became longer than memory wanted it to be. This evening, however, the road ahead was pleasantly familiar. The setting sun painted the fields in warm shades of amber, making every stalk of grain seem dipped in honey. Swallows darted through the air, chasing insects with astonishing precision, while somewhere in the distance a cow expressed what could only be described as a very strong opinion about absolutely everything. Aldrin smiled. Some things, thankfully, never changed. His boots were dusty enough to deserve names of their own. His cloak had been patched so many times that it looked less like one piece of cloth and more like several villages working together in peaceful agreement. Oddly enough, that made it warmer. As he climbed the final rise before the village, he paused. Below him rested the cluster of cottages where he had spent much of his youth. Thin columns of smoke curled lazily into the evening sky. Gardens overflowed with onions, herbs, and late-season vegetables. Chickens wandered wherever chickens believed important business was happening, which, judging by their confidence, appeared to be everywhere. A gentle breeze carried scents he had nearly forgotten. Fresh bread, wood smoke, apple peel, lavender drying outside someone's window. It is remarkable how a familiar smell can travel further into memory than an entire conversation. For a long moment, Aldrin simply stood there, not because he was tired, because he wanted the first glimpse to last. The village itself seemed almost untouched by time. Roofs had been repaired, fences leaned in slightly different directions than before. A few trees had grown taller. Otherwise, it felt like greeting an old friend who had aged kindly. As he walked down the hill, children chased one another between cottages, inventing games whose rules changed every 3 seconds. One proudly declared himself king. Another immediately announced a rebellion. The kingdom survived for nearly half a minute, a respectable reign by childhood standards. An elderly woman watering herbs noticed Aldrin approaching. She squinted, tilted her head, then smiled slowly. Well, she murmured to herself, either that's young Aldrin, or I've finally started mistaking travelers for memories. He bowed politely. I'm hoping for the first. She laughed softly. I was hoping so too. News traveled through medieval villages at astonishing speed. No one truly understood how. Some suspected gossip moved faster than horses. Others believed geese secretly organized everything. Frankly, neither theory could be entirely dismissed. Within minutes, several familiar faces appeared. A cooper with arms thicker than tree branches. A shepherd who somehow looked exactly the same, despite claiming to be 20 years older. A pair of sisters who still finished each other's sentences. Warm greetings came naturally. No one demanded long explanations. No one asked why he had stayed away so long. Sometimes genuine welcome requires fewer questions than strangers expect. As evening settled deeper over the fields, lanterns began appearing outside homes one by one, glowing like quiet stars brought gently down to earth. The village slowed. Axes stopped chopping wood. Wheels stopped turning. Laundry disappeared from clotheslines. Even the dogs seemed to agree that barking could probably wait until tomorrow. Aldrin continued strolling along the familiar lane, noticing details he had overlooked as a boy. Tiny carvings above doorways, carefully stacked firewood, bundles of herbs hanging beneath windows to dry. An old custom came back to him. Some families hung rosemary near their entrance, believing it helped guests arrive with cheerful thoughts instead of troubled ones. Whether or not it truly worked remained uncertain, but considering how pleasant everyone seemed, nobody was particularly eager to test the opposite. That curious tradition had survived generations, perhaps because hope is easier to maintain when it has something simple to hold on to. The sky shifted toward deep violet. Stars cautiously appeared overhead, some brighter than others, some hiding until darkness fully settled. Aldrin remembered lying in nearby fields as a child, trying to count them all. He never succeeded, mostly because someone inevitably claimed to have spotted a rabbit, a shooting star, or an unusually suspicious cloud. Children possess remarkable confidence in highly questionable observations. As he reached the center of the village, several neighbors greeted him with relaxed smiles and easy conversation. No one hurried. There was no reason to. The day's hardest work had already been completed. Now came the quieter hours that belonged to conversation, reflection, and companionship. Voices drifted gently through the cool air. Someone laughed loudly enough to startle a nearby pigeon. The pigeon appeared deeply offended. It recovered with admirable dignity. Aldrin found himself laughing too, not because anything extraordinary had happened, because ordinary happiness often arrives without announcing itself. He realized something then. The roads had given him countless adventures. Mountains, markets, castles glimpsed from distant hills. Storms survived. Friendships formed. But simple evenings like this, they had quietly become the rarest treasures of all. He took another slow breath, filling his lungs with familiar scents and familiar sounds, allowing years of wandering to settle gently behind him like dust finally falling from a well-traveled cloak. For the first time in many seasons, there was nowhere else he wished to be. The night was only beginning, and with it would come stories, laughter, old acquaintances, unexpected conversations, and memories waiting patiently to be rediscovered. Aldrin stepped forward with an easy smile, letting the peaceful rhythm of the village welcome him home, one quiet heartbeat at a time. The evening unfolded with the comfortable certainty of a well-worn path. Aldrin followed the familiar stream of villagers as they wandered toward the place where neighbors naturally gathered after the day's work was finished. No one announced that it was time to meet. No bell called them. It simply happened. The way birds found branches at sunset or sheep somehow decided together that one particular patch of grass was worth investigating. Someone clapped Aldrin gently on the shoulder. "I'd know that walk anywhere." He turned to find Thomas, whose dark hair had surrendered long ago to streaks of gray, but whose grin remained exactly as mischievous as it had been when they were boys. "You still sneak up on people," Aldrin said. "I call it walking quietly. I call it sneaking. It sounds friendlier my way." They laughed, the years between them, shrinking faster than either expected. There are friendships that require long explanations after time apart. And then there are the rare ones that simply continue, as though yesterday had merely been a rather long afternoon. Thomas wasted no time filling Aldrin in on village life. The blacksmith finally admitted his rooster isn't lucky. It took him 12 years, 11 years, 3 months, and one extremely embarrassing incident involving a cabbage cart. Aldrin blinked. "I almost don't want to know." "You absolutely do." Apparently, the blacksmith's famously confident rooster had wandered into the road just as a merchant's donkey decided it had reached its personal limit for carrying vegetables. The startled donkey bolted. Cabbages rolled everywhere. The rooster, entirely innocent, somehow became the village's unofficial symbol of spectacularly inconvenient timing. To this day, people claimed they could measure bad luck in units of half a rooster. It made absolutely no sense, which explained perfectly why everyone enjoyed repeating it. The pair continued strolling through the village lanes while neighbors greeted Aldrin with warm smiles. Some remembered him as the curious boy forever asking questions. Others remembered him as the young man forever leaving to see what lay beyond the next hill. One elderly carpenter chuckled. "So, did you ever find the end of the road?" Aldrin smiled. "No." "Good. Good. If someone found the end, everyone would want directions." The carpenter nodded wisely. "Far too much walking." That earned another round of laughter. The fading light wrapped the village in soft gold before slowly surrendering to shades of blue. Oil lamps flickered to life in windows, their glow reflecting gently across polished wooden shutters. Nearby, someone roasted chestnuts over glowing coals. Their sweet, earthy aroma drifted through the cool evening air, mixing with fresh herbs, baked bread, and the faint scent of rain, lingering in the soil from showers 2 days before. Memory has a curious habit of attaching itself to smells. Aldrin suddenly remembered his mother drying bundles of thyme beneath the eaves every autumn. He could almost hear her humming while she worked, never singing loudly enough for anyone to call it a performance, just enough for the herbs to have company. Thomas noticed his quiet expression. "You remembered something." "I did. The village does that." "It certainly does." Neither man felt the need to explain further. Silence between old friends is rarely empty. It simply gives memories enough room to sit down. As more neighbors gathered, conversations spread naturally into small circles. A pair of farmers debated whether this year's barley had grown taller because of generous rain or because old Bren insisted on talking encouragingly to his fields every morning. "I've told you," Bren declared with complete seriousness, "grain appreciates compliments." Someone folded their arms. "It has no ears. It has ambition." No one managed to argue with that. Whether plants truly benefited from cheerful conversation remained a mystery, but medieval farmers often held wonderfully practical superstitions. Across parts of Europe, some believed speaking kindly while sowing seeds encouraged stronger harvests, not because the crops literally listened, but because careful attention often produced better results. In its own quiet way, the custom reminded people to treat their work with patience. It was difficult to dislike a tradition that encouraged optimism. Children darted between adults, inventing games that changed every few moments. One group chased shadows. Another attempted to balance acorns on the tops of fence posts. A third appeared to be conducting highly serious negotiations with an exceptionally stubborn goose. The goose seemed to be winning, comfortably. Aldrin watched them with a smile. Travel had shown him magnificent cities with towering walls and bustling marketplaces where hundreds of voices merged into a constant roar. Yet none of those places possessed this particular kind of calm. Here everyone knew one another's strengths, and perhaps more importantly, everyone knew one another's ridiculous stories. Those stories became a sort of invisible thread, quietly stitching the community together. A woman carrying fresh honey cakes offered one to Aldrin. "You look thinner." "I've been walking." "Walk less. I'll consider it." She nodded approvingly. "Good. Eat another." It was impossible to refuse. The honey was rich without being overwhelming, and the soft cake nearly melted with each bite. Some recipes survived generations, not because anyone wrote them down, but because enough grandmothers refused to let them disappear. That seemed considerably more reliable than parchment. The conversations drifted naturally from harvests to weather, from weather to livestock, and somehow from livestock to whether owls secretly judged people. "I swear they do," said one shepherd. "They just stare." "They're owls." Exactly. Everyone accepted that explanation with surprising ease. A cool breeze swept gently through the village, carrying with it the rustling sound of leaves. Above, stars multiplied across the darkening sky. Without the bright lights of later centuries, the heavens seemed astonishingly alive. Every constellation appeared crisp enough to reach. Aldrin tilted his head upward. He had spent countless nights sleeping beneath those same stars while traveling. But tonight felt different. Tonight, he wasn't passing through. He belonged beneath this sky, even if only for a little while. As conversations continued, Aldrin found himself listening more than speaking. He heard stories of new marriages, successful harvests, recovered illnesses, broken wagon wheels repaired with remarkable creativity, goats rescued from places. Goats had absolutely no business reaching. Nobody exaggerated their importance. Life itself provided enough material. One tale flowed naturally into the next, each speaker handing the evening forward like passing a warm loaf around a shared table. Aldrin realized that these small stories would never be recorded by scholars. No royal chronicler would write about stubborn geese or ambitious grain. No grand history would preserve arguments over honey cakes or wandering goats. Yet these moments formed the true heartbeat of ordinary lives. Perhaps history often overlooked the quietest victories simply because they happened without fanfare. The laughter around him rose once more, warm and unforced, blending gently into the peaceful rhythm of the night. For the first time in many years, Aldrin no longer felt like a traveler returning home. He simply felt like a neighbor, listening to familiar voices beneath an ancient sky, exactly where he was meant to be. Near the edge of the gathering, where the warm smell of baked dough drifted through the evening like a friendly hand on the shoulder, Aldrin noticed Mara, the baker. She stood beside a basket covered with a clean linen cloth, watching the village chatter with the calm satisfaction of someone who had fed half the people there and knew it. Mara had been young when Aldrin left. Now she carried herself with the steady confidence of a woman who could judge an oven's heat with one raised eyebrow and silence. A greedy child with nothing more than a look. That, honestly, was power. Thomas leaned closer. "She still makes the seed loaves." Aldrin's face softened. Her mother's recipe? Her grandmother's, apparently. Or possibly her grandmother stole it from a traveling monk. The story changes when Mara is amused. Mara caught them looking and waved them over. "Well, Aldrin," she said, "you've returned with dust on your boots and questions in your eyes. Very dramatic. Nearly bard-worthy. I was aiming for humble. You missed." She lifted the linen from the basket, revealing small round loaves, glazed golden at the crust and sprinkled with dark seeds. The scent was rich and faintly sweet, with a hint of fennel and something sharper beneath it. Aldrin accepted one carefully. The first bite brought back years. Warm bread, soft inside, crisp outside, carrying the taste of autumn mornings and childhood errands, and waiting impatiently while adults insisted food had to cool before eating. A completely unreasonable rule, naturally. "This tastes exactly as I remember," he said. Mara smiled. "Good. That means I have not ruined my entire bloodline." A few villagers laughed. Then after a moment, Mara grew thoughtful. "My mother used to say the recipe was never really about the bread." "That sounds like something people say when they refuse to give away the recipe," Thomas said. "It also helped with that." She tucked the cloth neatly around the remaining loaves and began speaking, not loudly, but clearly enough for those nearby to listen. Her family, she explained, had kept a peculiar custom for generations. Each time they baked the first full batch after harvest, they marked one loaf with 3 tiny cuts across the top. Not deep enough to split it, just enough to recognize it after baking. That loaf was never sold, never eaten by the baker's household. Instead, before sunset, it was given quietly to whoever in the village seemed most in need of being remembered. Not always the poorest, not always the sickest. Sometimes it went to a widow who had stopped answering visitors, sometimes to a young father overwhelmed by work, sometimes to a proud old man who would never ask for help, but would accept bread if someone pretended it was extra. The important part was secrecy, no announcement, no public kindness wrapped in ribbons and polished until it looked impressive. Just bread at the door, warm if possible. Aldrin looked down at the loaf in his hands. "And people knew?" Mara shrugged. "Some guessed. Most pretended not to, which around here counts as excellent manners." The little circle grew quiet. There was something about humble generosity that made ordinary conversation step softly around it. Mara continued. Her grandmother had begun the custom during a hard winter when flour was scarce and tempers were thinner than soup at a miser's table. Instead of saving every scrap for her own family, she baked one small loaf and left it outside the home of a woman whose husband had died that autumn. The next week, someone left firewood at another door. Then mended gloves appeared on a bench. Then a child found a bundle of dried apples wrapped in cloth. No one admitted anything. No one needed to. Kindness had moved through the village, wearing a very convincing disguise. Aldrin smiled faintly. "So the bread started it." "That is what my grandmother claimed," Mara said. "Of course, she also claimed her oven had moods, so we must be careful with her authority." That earned a gentle ripple of laughter. Still, the story settled warmly among them. It explained something Aldrin had noticed without understanding as a boy. In this village, help rarely arrived as charity. It arrived as convenience, accident, surplus, mistake. A basket was too full. A cloak was too small. A stew was made in excess because someone misjudged the onions, which sounded suspicious, since nobody misjudged onions that generously. One of the village's odd little facts came from bakers like Mara. In some places, people once believed bread marked with 3 cuts could keep envy from entering a home. Scholars might shrug at such things, but villagers liked customs that gave fear somewhere. harmless to sit. A knife, a loaf, 3 lines, and suddenly the unknown felt a little more manageable. Humans have always been practical in strange ways. Aldrin turned the bread in his hands, noticing the 3 small marks on its crust. Mara saw his glance. "Not that one," she said softly. "That one is simply for eating." "Good," Thomas said. For a moment I feared Aldrin had become a symbolic burden. "I've been worse things." "Frequently, seasonally." Their laughter loosened the hush. Mara handed out more loaves, and soon the nearby villagers were eating quietly while the night settled deeper around them. A boy with flour still on his sleeve asked whether the secret loaf ever went to the wrong person. Mara considered. "Maybe, but I think a kindness that lands slightly crooked is still better than one that never leaves the hand." The boy nodded solemnly, as though storing the sentence somewhere important. Aldrin did the same. He thought of all the roads he had traveled, all the grand houses where generosity was displayed like a shield, polished and visible. Yet here, in this small village, the finest gift moved unseen, passing from door to door in the shape of bread, firewood, apples, mended cloth, or silence at the right moment. No trumpet, no witness, no applause. Just the gentle insistence that no one should be forgotten. The evening continued around him, soft and golden, but Aldrin felt changed by that small family secret. He looked at the faces nearby and saw not merely neighbors, but quiet guardians of one another's dignity. And as he ate the last warm bite of Mara's loaf, he understood that some villages were held together, not by walls, not by laws, not by wealth, but by people who knew when to knock, when to leave bread, and when to walk away, before gratitude became embarrassment. A rare wisdom, really, much rarer than good bread. Though, thankfully, this village seemed to have both. The first notes of music arrived so gently that Aldrin almost mistook them for the wind. A reed pipe sounded from somewhere near the gathering, thin and sweet, weaving through the low hum of voices like a silver thread through brown wool. Then came the soft pulse of a hand drum, steady as footsteps on a packed earth road. A fiddle joined after that, slightly uncertain at first, as though clearing its throat before remembering it had been invited. Thomas tilted his head. "Ah, the musicians have found courage." "Or ale," Aldrin said, often the same doorway. A few villagers shifted aside, leaving a rough open space beneath the darkening sky. No stage was needed, no announcement either. Medieval musicians, especially village musicians, often began the way rain begins, one drop, then another, and suddenly everyone understands what is happening. The players were simple folk. Perrin, who repaired shoes by day, held the fiddle under his chin with intense seriousness, as if negotiating peace between rival kingdoms. Lysa, the Reeves' niece, played the pipe with bright concentration. Old Fen beat the drum with one hand while using the other to keep his small grandson from crawling directly into history. The tune was modest, lilting, and familiar. Not grand enough for noble halls, not polished enough for courtly ears. Perfect, in other words. Aldrin watched as feet began tapping around him. At first, people pretended they were merely shifting weight. Respectable adults do this when music catches them before they are ready to admit joy. Then a girl took her brother's hands and spun him clumsily. A woman laughed and joined them. Soon half the village seemed pulled into motion. The dancing was not elegant. It was better than elegant. It was honest. Boots scuffed the ground. Skirts swung. Someone missed a step and apologized to a turnip basket. The basket accepted with quiet dignity, because turnips are famously forgiving when not being eaten. Thomas nudged Aldrin. Go on. I have spent years walking. That is enough footwork. Coward. Survivor. But Mara appeared with a grin and seized Aldrin's hand before argument could mature into strategy. No travelers are permitted to look thoughtful during music, she declared. That sounds like a law invented just now. All laws were invented just now at some point. Unfortunately, this was difficult to refute. So Aldrin let himself be drawn into the circle. At first, his body resisted, full of old road weariness and unnecessary dignity. Then the rhythm found him. The drum marked the earth beneath him. The pipe lifted the air above him. The fiddle stitched the two together. Step, turn, pause, laugh. He remembered, not perfectly of course. His left foot briefly entertained treason. But after a few turns, the old pattern returned, sleeping somewhere in muscle and bone. Around him, faces blurred in candlelight and starlight. Thomas clapped badly but enthusiastically. A child attempted a spin, lost balance, and was caught by 3 adults at once. Old Fenn's grandson finally escaped and began beating the ground with a spoon, contributing nothing useful and everything necessary. The music changed. The next tune was slower, softer, carrying a tender sway that made conversation fade. Couples moved with smaller steps. Older villagers remained seated, smiling into memory. Some watched the dancers. Others watched nothing at all, their eyes fixed gently on places only they could see. Aldrin stepped aside, breath warm in his chest. He leaned against a low fence, listening. There was a curious truth in village music. It did not ask anyone to be impressive. It did not demand skill. It gave people permission to be present together. That was its whole craft. Long before written notes became common among ordinary players, tunes traveled by ear, changing slightly with each village, each family, each pair of hands. A song might cross a kingdom and arrive at the far end, wearing a different coat, with a new ending and 3 extra verses about someone's unfortunate pig. This was not considered failure. This was tradition, doing what tradition does best, wandering off, returning late, and insisting it had improved itself. Aldrin had heard songs like that on the roads, the same melody here, but quicker. The same refrain there, but sadder. The same drinking tune, somewhere else, transformed into a lullaby by people with either great imagination or questionable judgment. Tonight, though, the song belonged exactly where it was. Lysa's pipe rose clear into the night. Perrin's fiddle followed, rough at the edges, but warm at the heart. The drum kept time beneath them, patient and low. Aldrin felt the village breathing with it. Even those who did not dance seemed included. A man sharpening a small knife paused his work. 2 sisters leaned shoulder to shoulder. The baker's boy, flowers still ghosting his hair, held a honey cake forgotten halfway to his mouth. That, Aldrin thought, was how you knew a tune had power. It could defeat cake, briefly. When the lively music returned, laughter surged again. Thomas, who had mocked Aldrin mercilessly, was pulled into the circle and immediately proved that confidence and ability were entirely different animals. His first turn sent his cap flying. His second nearly introduced him to the ground. His third was saved only by Mara, who guided him back into rhythm with the patience of someone rescuing a goose from philosophy. "You dance like a sack of walnuts," she told him. "A graceful sack. No, an ambitious sack. Perhaps." Everyone nearby laughed, and Thomas bowed deeply, accepting the partial victory. The evening no longer felt like a series of separate conversations. Music had gathered everything into one shared pulse, The old stories, the bread, the returning traveler, the children, the memories hovering close, but not heavy. Aldrin found himself humming along. He did not know all the words anymore. That hardly mattered. Others did. Their voices rose gently, not polished, not perfectly tuned, but sincere enough to soften the air. The song spoke of fields after rain, of lamps in windows, of someone coming home by moonlight. A simple song, maybe even a foolish one. But simple things become precious when they are carried by many voices. Above them, stars burned steadily. Below them, the village moved in warmth and rhythm. Aldrin realized that all his travels had taught him to admire distance, but this evening was teaching him something quieter. Sometimes wonder did not wait beyond the horizon. Sometimes it stood nearby, tapping a drum, laughing at bad dancing, and remembering the words when you could not. The final note faded slowly. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then applause rose, soft but heartfelt, with a few cheerful whistles and one dramatic shout from a child who seemed to believe the musicians had personally saved the kingdom. Perrin bowed with excessive dignity. Old Fen lifted his drum. Lysa blushed and smiled. The night settled again, but not as before. It had been brightened from within, warmed by melody and movement, and Aldrin carried that warmth quietly as voices resumed around him. The evening continued, softer now, as if the music had taught everyone how to listen more kindly. After the music faded, the village seemed to rest inside its own echo. People returned to quieter conversation, though now their voices carried the loosened warmth that follows shared laughter. Children, tired from dancing and rebellion against invisible kingdoms, leaned against parents or curled beside baskets like puppies, pretending they had never caused trouble in their lives. Aldrin settled near an old shepherd named Edric, who sat with both hands wrapped around a wooden cup. Edric had always looked ancient. Even when Aldrin was young, he had seemed carved from hill wind, sheep wool, and mild disapproval. His beard was whiter now, his shoulders a little narrower, but his eyes remained sharp enough to count lambs in fog and notice lies before they had finished putting on their boots. He nodded at Aldrin. "You came back." "I did. Roads lose their charm eventually." "Some of them." Edric grunted. That was nearly a speech from him. Thomas lowered himself nearby, still recovering from his heroic defeat by dancing. "Tell him about the thing in the hills," Thomas said. Edric's eyes narrowed. "No." "Yes. It was nothing." "That is exactly what people say when it was something." A few villagers nearby turned with interest. Apparently, this story had been debated before, which meant it had already achieved respectable local immortality. Aldrin smiled. "What thing?" Edric sighed the sigh of a man surrounded by people determined to enjoy themselves at his expense. "Fine," he said, "but if anyone adds wings to it again, I'm leaving." That, naturally, made everyone listen harder. The story had happened 3 winters earlier, on a pale morning after frost had silvered the hills. Edric had taken the sheep toward the upper pasture, where the grass still showed through in stubborn green patches. The air was clear. The sky was bright. The sheep were behaving with the approximate intelligence of damp mittens. A normal morning, then. He had been checking a low stone wall when he noticed every sheep lift its head at once. Not one, not a few, all of them. Their ears turned toward the same narrow hollow between 2 hills. "That," Edric said, "is not something sheep do unless there is a dog, a wolf, thunder, or a bucket." "A bucket?" Aldrin asked. "Sheep respect buckets." No one argued. Edric followed their gaze and saw something moving in the hollow. Not large, not threatening, just strange. A pale shape drifted between the frost-whitened stones, low to the ground and slow as mist. At first he thought it was a stray cloth blown loose from some cart. Then it stopped. Cloth, in Edric's considerable experience, did not usually stop to observe shepherds. The sheep remained frozen. Edric took one cautious step forward. The pale shape moved again, gliding between two thorn bushes. It made no sound. It left no clear track in the frost. Then, as sunlight touched the hollow fully, it vanished behind a broken bit of wall and did not emerge. Naturally, Edric did what any sensible man would do. He waited several minutes and pretended he had intended to stand there anyway. "I was assessing the wall," he insisted. Thomas coughed. "From a safe distance. A professional distance." Eventually, Edric went to look. Behind the wall, he found no creature, no cloth, no person hiding with the patience of a saint and the hobbies of a fool. Only frost, a few old stones, and one clump of white wool snagged on a thorn. That was all. The villagers had spent 3 years deciding whether the shape had been a wandering goat, a spirit, a trick of light, a lost pilgrim's cloak, or Edric's breakfast, disagreeing with him. "My breakfast was oats," Edric said firmly. "Oats do not create phantoms." "Depends on the oats," Mara muttered. The laughter was gentle. Aldrin looked toward the dark outline of the hills beyond the village. "What do you think it was?" Edric stared into his cup. "I think," he said slowly, "that hills keep some things for themselves." The answer quieted the group, not fearfully, thoughtfully. Every village had places like that. A bend in the stream where people lowered their voices. A grove where birds went strangely silent. A ruined wall that children dared one another to touch at dusk. The world was full of ordinary explanations, yes, but it was also large enough to leave room for uncertainty. Medieval shepherds carried many peculiar beliefs. In some regions, people thought sheep could sense storms, spirits, illness, and sometimes the moral quality of strangers. This was deeply unfair to strangers and gave sheep far too much responsibility. But when your flock panicked before bad weather, it was easy to grant them mysterious wisdom. Edric claimed he did not believe such nonsense. He also admitted he watched the sheep carefully whenever they all looked in the same direction, which was not belief, of course, merely caution, wearing a sensible cloak. Aldrin enjoyed that. He had seen enough of the world to know that certainty could be overrated. A person could spend years naming every road and still be surprised by a shadow in frost. Thomas leaned back. "You forgot the part where Bren said it was a mooncalf." "I ignored the part where Bren said it was a mooncalf," Edric replied. "What is a mooncalf?" asked the baker's boy. "Something people blame when they are tired of saying, 'I don't know,'" said Mara. "Also," Thomas added, "possibly a very confused cow." The boy nodded, satisfied. That was village education at work. Incomplete, memorable, and occasionally involving livestock. The conversation drifted into other strange sightings. A blue flame seen once over marshy ground. A fox that followed a funeral procession and then disappeared. A crow that stole exactly one silver button from the Reeves' coat and never returned for the matching one, suggesting either supernatural purpose or poor taste. Each story remained harmless, softened by laughter and distance. No one wanted terror. The night was too peaceful for that. They wanted wonder with its teeth politely removed. Aldrin listened as the tales circled gently, each one leaving a little space for mystery. He realized these stories mattered not because they were true in the plain sense, but because they gave the village a shared border with the unknown. The hills were not just hills. The fields were not just fields. Even frost and wool and old stones could become a story if enough people cared to remember them. Edric finished his cup and stood slowly. I still say it was nothing. Of course, Thomas said, and if it comes again, I am telling none of you. Of course. The old shepherd walked away with careful dignity, though Aldrin saw the corner of his mouth twitch. Above the village, the hills lay dark beneath the stars, calm and unreadable. Aldrin looked at them for a long moment, feeling no fear, only the quiet pleasure of a world not entirely explained, and somewhere beyond the last cottage, a sheep bleated once in the darkness, as if adding its expert opinion. Naturally, everyone ignored it, mostly. The laughter stirred by Edric's tale lingered pleasantly in the cool night air. Like ripples on a quiet pond, it slowly settled into softer conversations, until the village once again found its comfortable rhythm. The musicians had laid their instruments aside for a while. Children were beginning to yawn between bursts of energy, and somewhere nearby, an owl announced its presence with such confidence that it sounded as though it had personally been appointed guardian of the evening. Aldrin wandered a little farther down the familiar lane, letting his feet decide the path. Sometimes memories worked best that way. A turn here, a crooked fence there. An old pear tree that somehow seemed both smaller and taller than he remembered. Smaller because he was no longer a boy. Taller because time had given it another 20 years to stretch toward the stars. As he rounded the corner beside the village well, he heard a familiar voice. I wondered how long it would take. Aldrin stopped. Leaning comfortably against the low stone wall stood Rowan. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then both smiled at exactly the same moment. Rowan stepped forward first. You've grown older. So have you. I wear it better. I'll allow that. They embraced warmly, clapping one another firmly on the back in the awkward but sincere way that lifelong friends often do. When they stepped apart, Aldrin studied him more carefully. Rowan's shoulders had broadened from years of labor. A few silver threads touched his dark beard. Small laugh lines framed his eyes, suggesting that life had given him plenty of reasons to smile, and perhaps a few reasons to laugh simply because the alternative required too much effort. You disappeared, Rowan said. I traveled. You disappeared stylishly. I tried. I always suspected you'd come back eventually. What made you so certain? Rowan shrugged. You never stopped talking about this place. Aldrin considered that. Perhaps it was true. Even while crossing distant valleys or sleeping beneath unfamiliar skies, he had often compared those places to home. Not because they were worse, simply because home had quietly become the measure against which everything else was weighed. The two men began walking together through the peaceful village. Neither hurried to fill every silence. Old friendships rarely feared quiet moments. Eventually, Rowan nodded toward the fields beyond the cottages. I still farm the eastern meadow. The one that always flooded? Not anymore. No? We finally convinced the stream to behave. Aldrin laughed. You negotiated with water? We dug a ditch. Less impressive. Far more effective. Practical wisdom, Aldrin reflected, usually sounded less dramatic than people hoped. As they walked, Rowan pointed out small changes that had accumulated over the years. A new orchard planted after an especially generous harvest. A stone bridge repaired by nearly the entire village over one long summer. The old ash tree struck by lightning, though somehow still alive, and producing leaves every spring. It refuses to quit, Rowan said. So do you. We learned from each other. Nearby, several children were attempting to roll a wooden hoop along the lane. The hoop stubbornly chose its own direction. One boy chased after it with heroic determination before tripping gently into a patch of grass. He immediately stood, brushed himself off with enormous dignity, and declared that he had meant to inspect the ground all along. Aldrin smiled. Children possessed a remarkable talent for transforming accidents into deliberate strategy. I used to think leaving was the brave thing, Aldrin said after a while. And now? Now I'm not so sure. Rowan glanced toward him. You've seen more of the world than I ever will. Perhaps. So you found what you were looking for? Aldrin thought carefully before answering. I found many things. But I kept expecting one extraordinary place to make me feel complete. Rowan nodded slowly. And? It never happened. Instead of responding immediately, Rowan bent to pick up a smooth stone from the roadside. He turned it thoughtfully in his hand. When we were boys, he said, I thought happiness would arrive after the next harvest. I remember. Then after buying another field, he tossed the stone gently into the grass. Then after repairing the roof. And did it? No. Aldrin looked at him. So where did you finally find it? Rowan smiled toward the softly glowing cottage windows. It was already here. The answer hung comfortably between them. Not boastful, not triumphant, simply true. They continued walking until they reached the old village well. Its stone rim had been worn smooth by countless hands over generations. A wooden bucket rested beside it, polished by use rather than decoration. I proposed to Elspeth here, Rowan said. Aldrin raised an eyebrow. Romantic. I panicked. Less romantic. I had planned an eloquent speech. What happened? I forgot every word. So what did you say? Rowan rubbed the back of his neck, laughing. I asked whether she thought the bucket looked unusually sturdy. Aldrin stared. That cannot be true. It absolutely is. And she accepted? She laughed for nearly 5 minutes. Then she said yes. Aldrin shook his head. You accidentally courted your wife with carpentry. The bucket was exceptionally well made. Sometimes love, he reflected, required less poetry than people imagined. A curious medieval belief held that drawing the first bucket of water together after a wedding brought good fortune to a marriage. Whether the custom truly changed anyone's future was impossible to say, but it certainly encouraged newly married couples to cooperate from the very beginning, a practical lesson disguised as tradition. Villages were wonderfully inventive that way. They wrapped ordinary wisdom inside memorable customs until the two became impossible to separate. The conversation drifted naturally toward old companions. Some had settled in neighboring villages. A few had joined monasteries. Others had become merchants, millers, or craftsmen. Several had passed away over the years. Their names were spoken gently, without lingering sadness. Instead, Rowan attached a small memory to each one. He could never whistle. She baked plum tarts every autumn. He once fell asleep standing against a fence. She beat everyone at dice and insisted it was luck. Each recollection ended with quiet smiles. It struck Aldrin that people did not truly disappear, while stories still carried them forward. Memory was its own kind of hearth. Before long they reached the edge of the village, where open fields stretched beneath a sky overflowing with stars. The wheat whispered softly in the breeze. Crickets sang without interruption. Somewhere far away, a dog barked once before apparently deciding the matter was no longer urgent. Rowan folded his arms. You know, he said. "When you left, I envied you." "You did? I thought adventure lived somewhere else. And now, I think adventure visited here every day." Aldrin followed his gaze across the peaceful fields, the changing seasons, the planting, the harvest, children growing into adults, neighbors helping one another without keeping score. Perhaps those things lacked the excitement of distant kingdoms, yet they possessed something else, a quiet depth that only revealed itself to those willing to remain long enough to notice. For several minutes, the two friends simply stood beneath the stars. No speeches, no dramatic revelations, only the comforting presence of someone who had known them before. Either had imagined the lives they would one day lead. Sometimes friendship did not offer answers. It simply reminded a person which questions mattered. Aldrin breathed deeply, filling his lungs with cool night air, scented faintly with grain and wildflowers. The road had changed him. The village had changed too. Yet standing beside Rowan, neither change felt like loss. Instead, it felt like two different journeys arriving peacefully at the same place. By the time Aldrin and Rowan returned toward the heart of the village, the night had gathered fully around the cottages. Not heavily, not ominously, just deeply, like a dark wool cloak drawn over tired shoulders. The last violet edge of sunset had vanished behind the western hills, and the stars now showed themselves without shyness. Lamps glowed in windows. Lanterns hung from hooks beside doors. Candles flickered wherever people sat together, each small flame bending and straightening in the breeze. Like it had opinions, but was trying to remain polite. Aldrin noticed how the village seemed softer by candlelight. Faces looked gentler. Voices lowered naturally. Even laughter changed, becoming warmer, rounder, less eager to leap across the lane and frighten innocent chickens. A few villagers had gathered near a sheltered wall where several candles rested in clay cups. Their flames shivered behind little rims of baked earth, protected from the wind. The light painted everyone in golden shadow, making old faces look thoughtful and young faces look almost enchanted. Mara was there, along with Thomas, Edric, Rowan, and several others. Aldrin settled among them. No one asked where he had gone. No one asked what he and Rowan had discussed. That was another mercy of village life. Everyone knew when curiosity should put its shoes back under the bed and stay there. A woman named Isolde was trimming one of the candle wicks with careful fingers. "Too long," she murmured. "Makes the flame smoke." Thomas leaned toward Aldrin. "Isolde speaks to candles as if they are apprentices." "They listen better than apprentices," she said without looking up. "Fair." The candle steadied after she trimmed it, burning cleanly and bright. Aldrin watched the small flame. There was something quietly brave about it. Not grand, not heroic, not the sort of thing bards would fight over for the privilege of exaggerating. Just a little light, holding its place against a large darkness. Perhaps that was enough. "Winter will come early," Edric said. Several heads turned. He shrugged. "The sheep have thickened." "The sheep?" Thomas asked. "They know." Mara smiled into her cup. "The sheep know everything, except how not to get stuck in hedges." "That is a separate wisdom," Edric replied. The conversation drifted toward preparations for colder months. Firewood stacked beneath eaves, apples dried and stored, barrels checked for leaks, blankets mended, roofs patched before rain, found every lazy nail and exposed it like a gossip with excellent timing. Aldrin listened with growing appreciation. On the road, winter was something to survive. Here, winter was something faced together. One person had extra straw, another had salt. Someone else knew how to mend boots properly, which in cold weather was less a craft and more a sacred calling. Isolde finished tending the candles and sat back. My grandmother used to say, every household should keep one candle for the darkest night. The darkest night? Aldrin asked. The night when someone's courage thins. No one laughed at that. She continued softly. It did not need to be special. Tallow, beeswax, rushlight, whatever could be spared. But she said there should always be one light saved, because despair is rude and tends to arrive uninvited. Thomas nodded solemnly. Like my cousin. Exactly like your cousin. The laughter came gently and then faded. Aldrin liked the saying, one candle for the darkest night. It sounded superstitious, perhaps, but also practical. People often endured hardship better when they could point to a small promise and say, not yet, not all is spent. A curious old habit existed in some villages. Rushlights were made by soaking dried rush stems in fat, creating a humble lamp that burned for a short while. They were smoky, fragile, and not especially glamorous. No noble poet ever sighed, "Ah, my love, your beauty is like a rushlight," unless he wished to remain unmarried. Yet for ordinary people, such poor little lights stretched the evening, protected work, and softened fear. Small flames mattered, especially when darkness was large. The group fell into a thoughtful quiet, not sad, just aware. The kind of quiet that arrives when people have worked hard, laughed well, eaten enough, and now feel safe enough to think honestly. Rowan spoke first. When the bridge washed out 5 springs ago, I thought we would lose the mill road for good. Mara nodded. We nearly did. But everyone came. Everyone complained, Thomas added. And came, Rowan said. Complaining helps the arms work. Aldrin smiled. He could imagine it clearly. Villagers knee-deep in mud, hauling stones, arguing over ropes, slipping, shouting, laughing, and somehow rebuilding what water had taken. No hero in shining armor, no royal command, just neighbors who understood that waiting for rescue was often less useful than getting wet together. Isolde turned her cup slowly between her palms. My youngest was sick that year. I remember, Mara said. I barely left the house. But every morning there was something at the door. Broth, bread, firewood, once, an entire sack of turnips. Thomas looked proud. That was me. I guessed. Too many turnips? An emotional number of turnips. They were supportive turnips. They were aggressively supportive. The circle laughed softly. Aldrin found himself smiling with them, but beneath the humor, he felt the deeper truth of the memory. People here did not always have much, yet what they had, they divided carefully, quietly, and sometimes in root vegetables. Hope, he thought, was not always bright. Sometimes it looked like a sack of turnips left outside a door, sometimes like a repaired bridge, sometimes like a candle saved for the night when courage thinned. The flames before them trembled, then steadied again. A breeze moved through the lane, carrying the scent of damp grass and distant wood smoke. Above, the stars remained untouched by village troubles, which might have seemed cruel if they were not so beautiful. Edric cleared his throat. Patience is underrated. That caught everyone's attention. Coming from him, 3 words together nearly counted as a public lecture. He looked at Aldrin. You learn it with sheep. I imagine sheep require much patience. Sheep require all patience. Then they eat your sleeve. Wise creatures. No, Edric lifted his cup. But storms pass, lambs stand, grass returns. A man who forgets that becomes unpleasant company. Thomas raised his cup too. To not becoming unpleasant company. Too late for some, Mara murmured. Cruel, but fair. The toast passed around the circle, not loud, not formal. Just a shared acknowledgement that life was easier when people remembered hardship did not get the final word every time. Aldrin raised his cup last. He thought of lonely roads, cold mornings, mistakes made far from home, and the strange pride that had kept him moving even when rest might have been wiser. He had mistaken motion for strength more than once. Now, surrounded by candlelight, he wondered whether resilience looked less like constant travel and more like staying, tending, repairing, waiting, sharing. The candle flames flickered across familiar faces. Each person carried burdens Aldrin did not fully know. Losses, fears, regrets, private aches tucked neatly behind ordinary expressions. Yet here they sat together, passing warmth from one voice to another. The darkness beyond the candles remained real, but it did not enter the circle. Not tonight. Aldrin breathed slowly, feeling the calm settle through him. He understood then that hope was rarely a trumpet blast or a miracle descending from the clouds with excellent posture. More often it was smaller and stubborn. A flame cupped against wind, a neighbor at the door, an old shepherd saying grass returns. And in that gentle glow, the village seemed not untouched by darkness, but quietly practiced at keeping it from winning. Sometime after the talk of candles and winter stores, a new sound entered the village lane. It was not music. It was not laughter. It was the slow clink and shuffle of someone carrying too many things and pretending this was completely under control. A donkey appeared first, stepping into the candlelit edge of the gathering with the tragic patience of an animal that had accepted civilization as a personal burden. Behind it came a small cart covered in tied cloth bundles, wicker cases, leather pouches, and one suspiciously lopsided cage from which nothing moved, thankfully. Beside the cart walked a merchant in a patched blue cloak, his hat tilted at a heroic angle, likely because it had lost an argument with a branch. Thomas brightened. "Ah, Cedric," Mara sighed. "Hide your coins." Cedric the merchant raised both hands. "Cruel words. I bring wonders." "You bring clutter," Mara said. "Wonders are clutter before they are understood." That sounded wise enough to be dangerous. Cedric had visited the village twice a year for as long as Aldrin could remember. He sold needles, ribbons, combs, knife handles, salt, small mirrors, buttons, thread, and other useful things. Yet what people remembered him for were the useless things he carried with absolute confidence. Aldrin stepped closer as Cedric began untying bundles. "Well, well," the merchant said, squinting. "Aldrin? In the flesh. Still traveling?" "Less than before." "Good. Roads make men thin and suspicious." "Trade makes men dramatic," Cedric smiled. "Only the successful ones." Soon villagers gathered around the cart, drawn by curiosity as surely as cats were drawn to unattended fish. Cedric spread a cloth over the cartboard and began arranging objects in the candlelight. A little brass bell shaped like a pear, a string of blue glass beads, a carved bone whistle, a tiny wooden box with no visible hinge, a spoon from a distant town, though why the spoon had needed to travel so far remained unclear. "This," Cedric announced, lifting the brass bell, "was made by a craftsman near the coast." "What does it do?" asked the baker's boy. "It rings." The boy stared. "My apologies," Cedric added. "It rings beautifully." He shook it. The bell made a polite little sound, like a fairy clearing its throat. Everyone nodded, because it was difficult to criticize something so harmless. Next came the wooden box. Cedric placed it in Mara's hands. "Open it." She turned it over, pressing each side. Nothing happened. Thomas tried next. Nothing. Rowan tried with a farmer's practical suspicion. Still nothing. Finally, Cedric took it back, tapped one corner twice, slid a hidden panel with his thumb, and the lid popped open. Inside lay a single dried violet. The children gasped. Mara raised an eyebrow. "You trapped a flower in a stubborn box." "I preserved beauty." "You delayed disappointment." "Both can be true." Aldrin laughed quietly. The merchant's objects had a strange power, not because they were valuable, but because each had collected distance. They smelled faintly of other roads, other hands, other hearths. A comb might have passed through 3 markets. A bead might have crossed a river valley. A scrap of dyed silk might have begun in a town no one there would ever see. Cedric held up a small round disc of polished dark stone. "Jet," he said, "from far northern cliffs." The stone reflected the candlelight in a soft black gleam. Aldrin had seen jet before, worn as beads by pilgrims and widows. In some places, people believed it guarded against misfortune or melancholy. Whether it truly did so was doubtful, but it was light, beautiful, and warm quickly in the hand, which already made it more comforting than many expensive things. A woman touched it with one finger. "It looks like night made solid," Cedric pointed at her. "Exactly. I shall use that." "You shall pay her," Mara said. "I shall remember her fondly." Thief. Poet. Same family. The evening warmed with fresh amusement. One by one, Cedric displayed his curious collection. A scrap of parchment with a drawing of a fish that looked offended. A painted wooden saint missing one hand. Though Cedric insisted, the missing hand made the blessing more mysterious. A tin badge shaped like a shell, the sort pilgrims wore after long journeys. A packet of bright yellow dye that caused every mother present to look immediately suspicious. A narrow strip of embroidered cloth from a border fair, stitched with tiny birds so round they looked personally insulted by flight. Aldrin picked up the pilgrim badge. It was light and cool, stamped thin enough to bend. He remembered seeing travelers wear similar tokens on cloaks and hats, little signs of roads taken for prayer, promise, grief, or hope. "Where did this come from?" he asked. Cedric's expression softened. "A woman traded it for shoe nails. Said she had carried it far enough." Aldrin turned the badge in his palm. Far enough. There was a whole life hidden in those 2 words. Cedric did not explain more. Perhaps he did not know. Perhaps he did, and understood some stories should not be sold twice. The children preferred the whistle, naturally. Cedric handed it to the baker's boy, who blew with all the solemn force of a royal herald. No sound emerged. He tried again. Still nothing. Cedric nodded gravely. "It summons invisible ducks." The boy's eyes widened. Mara folded her arms. "It does not." "How would you know?" "No ducks arrived." "Invisible ducks," Cedric repeated. Thomas leaned toward Aldrin. "I want to disapprove, but the argument is strong." The boy continued blowing silently into the whistle, delighted beyond reason. That was another kind of magic. Not the whistle. The permission to imagine. Cedric eventually sold needles to Isolde, salt to Rowan, thread to Mara, and the brass bell to Edric, who claimed it was for tracking sheep and not because he liked the sound. No one believed him. Aldrin bought nothing at first. He simply watched. The merchant's cart had turned the quiet evening outward, reminding the village that beyond its fields lay ports, roads, fairs, shrines, forests, cliffs, and towns where strangers shaped bells like piers for reasons known only to themselves and possibly their mothers. Yet the objects did not make Aldrin restless, not as they once might have. Instead, they brought the wider world gently into the circle of candlelight, made small enough to hold, harmless enough to pass from hand to hand. Finally, Cedric reached into a pouch and drew out a plain copper button. "For you," he said to Aldrin. Aldrin looked surprised. "I haven't paid. It is a gift. From a merchant? Do not ruin the moment." The button was simple, round, and slightly worn. "Why?" Cedric shrugged. "You look like a man who has lost more buttons than he admits." Thomas nodded. "That is painfully plausible." Aldrin accepted it with a smile. The gift was absurdly modest, and somehow perfect. As the villagers returned to examining the cart, Aldrin slipped the button into his pouch. He had carried coins, maps, charms, letters, and once, very briefly, a beetle he mistook for a black pebble. Few things had felt as unexpectedly touching as this small, useless kindness. The night continued around him, filled with candlelight, strange objects, and soft laughter. The world was wide. Yes. But here it was, gathered quietly on a cart behind a tired donkey, while neighbors debated invisible ducks beneath the stars. As Cedric's cart drew its little crowd, Aldrin noticed someone sitting slightly apart from the bustle. Her name was Eleanor. Most people in the village called her Widow Eleanor, though never with pity in their voices. She was too sharp for pity and too kind for fear, which made everyone treat her with the careful respect usually reserved for hot ovens and old cats. She sat on a low bench near the edge of the candlelight, wrapped in a dark shawl, watching Cedric argue with Thomas over whether invisible ducks required imaginary grain. Aldrin approached and bowed his head. "Eleanor," she looked up. "Aldrin, you have returned thinner, dustier, and with more patience in your face. I hope that is good. It is better than more foolishness. Then I count myself fortunate." She patted the bench beside her. "Sit. Standing makes young men think they are going somewhere." Aldrin obeyed. For a while they watched the village together. Eleanor had lost her husband many years before, and though grief had marked her life, it had not made her bitter. It had made her attentive. She noticed when someone was tired, when laughter sounded forced, when a child hovered too near the edge of tears. That kind of wisdom rarely announced itself. It simply handed you a blanket before you realized you were cold. "You have seen distant places," she said. "A few." "And did they explain anything?" Aldrin smiled. "Less than I hoped." "Good. Explanations are often overrated. Bread is better." That seems to be a village philosophy. It should be a royal decree. She folded her hands in her lap. "When my husband died, people told me time would heal it. That was nonsense, of course." Aldrin stayed quiet. Time does not heal like a physician. It is more like a slow carpenter. It builds shelves around the pain, so you have somewhere to put other things. The words settled gently between them. No one nearby interrupted. Eleanor continued, her voice calm, almost practical. "At first, everything in the house accused me. His cup, his boots, the stool by the door, even the stupid onion knife." "The onion knife?" "He sharpened it badly, always. It cut sideways, like it had moral confusion." Aldrin laughed softly. "I hated that knife. Then I loved it. Then I hated that I loved it. Grief is very untidy." She looked toward the children clustered around Cedric's silent whistle. "So I began doing one small thing each morning. Not a brave thing, not a grand thing, just one thing. Sweep the hearth, mend a cuff, feed the hens, boil water. One thing became two. Two became a day. Days became seasons." Aldrin thought of roads stretching endlessly ahead. He had always believed endurance meant pressing forward. Eleanor made it sound smaller and stronger. In old households, she said, some women kept what they called a grief cloth, a scrap from a sleeve, a ribbon, a torn bit of linen from someone they loved. They tucked it away, not to stare at every day, but to know memory had a proper place. Strange little custom. Sensible, though. People behave better when sorrow is given a chair instead of allowed to wander about knocking over cups. Aldrin smiled. That is an excellent image. It is an excellent truth. The village laughter rose again as Edric's new brass bell made its tiny ringing sound. Eleanor glanced over. He will pretend that bell is useful. It might be. It sounds like a mouse entering court. Aldrin almost choked on a laugh. She looked pleased. Do not mistake quiet evenings for empty ones, she said after a moment. This is when people become themselves again. How so? In daylight, everyone has duties. Farmer, baker, shepherd, widow, wife, son, fool with a cart full of nonsense. Cedric? Naturally. But in the evening, when work loosens its grip, people remember they are more than what they must do. Aldrin looked around. Mara laughing with Isolde. Rowan speaking with his daughter. Thomas trying and failing to make the silent whistle produce any sound. Edric holding the little bell near his ear when he thought no one noticed. Eleanor was right. The evening had opened a gentle space where everyone could lay down the weight of usefulness. Did you ever wish to leave? Aldrin asked, after he died. Yes. Every day for a season. I thought distance might make grief smaller. And did you go? No. The hens would have judged me. Terrifying creatures. Merciless. Her smile faded into something softer. I stayed because people kept needing small things. A poultice, a story, someone to sit beside the sick, someone to tell a bride that fear before marriage is not prophecy, someone to tell an old man that pride is a poor blanket. That sounds like a full life. It became one. Aldrin heard no boast in her voice, only surprise, perhaps, that survival had slowly turned into service. She reached into the pocket of her shawl and drew out a tiny spindle whorl, smooth and worn, made of pale clay. My husband carved a mark into this when we were young, she said. A dreadful little flower. Look at it. More cabbage than blossom. Aldrin examined it carefully. The flower did, admittedly, resemble a cabbage with ambition. I kept it, she said, not because it is beautiful, because his hand was once here. She took it back and closed her fingers around it. Things do not need to be grand to hold love. Remember that. Aldrin nodded. He thought of Mara's bread, Cedric's copper button, Rowan's ridiculous proposal by the well, Isolde's candle, Edric's mysterious wool in the frost. Small things, holding more than they seemed able to carry. Eleanor stood slowly. Aldrin rose at once to help, but she waved him off. I am old, not ruined. My mistake, a common one. Before she left, she turned back. You came home looking for something, whether you meant to or not. Aldrin did not answer. She did not need him to. You may not find it in one evening, but do not hurry past the quiet parts. They are often where the answer sits, too polite to interrupt. Then she walked back toward the others, her shawl dark against the candlelight. Aldrin remained beside the bench, breathing in the cool night air. The village carried on around him, unchanged and yet somehow deepened. He felt as though Eleanor had opened a door in the evening, revealing that beneath its simple warmth lay patience, grief, memory, courage, and love folded carefully into ordinary hours. No trumpet announced such wisdom. No scholar carved it into stone. It lived instead in widows, bakers, shepherds, old friends, and stubborn hens. And Aldrin, standing quietly beneath the stars, began to understand why the road had never fully satisfied him. It had shown him wonders, but this place was teaching him how to stay awake to them. The laughter around Cedric's cart gradually softened into something slower, not sadness, something gentler. The kind of quiet that arrives when the night grows older and people begin remembering those who are not standing beside them anymore. It started when Cedric, while packing away his strange little treasures, uncovered a wooden cup wrapped in cloth. He paused when he saw it, and for once, his mouth did not immediately prepare a sales pitch. Thomas noticed. "That was Garrick's, wasn't it?" Cedric nodded. He traded it to me for a knife handle years ago, then stole it back during dice. You cannot steal back your own cup." "He managed." Several villagers smiled. Aldrin remembered Garrick faintly. Broad laugh, crooked nose, always claiming his mule understood Latin. The mule, by all evidence, understood carrots and nothing else. Rowan lifted his cup. "To Garrick." The others followed. "To Garrick." The words were not heavy. They rose softly, warmly, as though calling across a field. Mara added, "And to his mule, who was wiser than he was." "Most doors were wiser than Garrick," Eleanor said. "That too." Aldrin raised his drink with them, feeling the shape of the moment. This was not mourning exactly. It was remembrance with its boots off. One name led to another. Old Lysa's father, who could mend any hinge, but never arrive anywhere on time. The twins' mother, who sang while washing linen, and once chased a fox from her hens with nothing but a ladle and terrifying confidence. A boy named Fenric, lost to fever young, remembered for putting beetles in the priest's shoe, and then confessing before anyone noticed, because guilt had apparently outrun mischief that earned tender laughter. Medieval villages remembered through repetition. Names stayed alive because people spoke them during work, meals, festivals, and evenings like this. In some places, families left an empty chair or untouched cup during certain winter nights, not from fear, but from courtesy. The dead were not expected to sit down and complain about the stew. Still, memory appreciated manners. Aldrin found himself thinking of his own parents. He had avoided that thought most of the evening, not from coldness, but because some memories needed quiet hands. His mother's humming, his father's slow way of sharpening tools, the way both had watched him when he first spoke of leaving, proud and afraid at once. Rowan must have sensed the change in him. "They spoke of you often," he said softly. Aldrin looked down. "I should have returned sooner." "Yes," Rowan said. No comfort rushed in. No polite lie softened the word. Then Rowan added, "And you returned tonight." Aldrin swallowed. It was not forgiveness exactly. It was something more useful, a place to begin. Mara came near and placed a small piece of bread in his hand, without comment. Of course she did. Bakers appeared to believe every emotional difficulty could be improved by carbohydrates, and annoyingly, they were often correct. Aldrin ate slowly. The bread was cool now, but still good. Thomas stood then, slightly unsteady in the theatrical way of a man who wished everyone to think he had been drinking more than he had. "A toast," he said. "Oh no," Mara murmured. "A fine toast." "That remains to be seen." Thomas ignored her with professional skill. "To absent friends," he said, lifting his cup. "May we remember their best stories, forgive their worst habits, and never repeat the songs they sang off-key unless absolutely necessary." "That last part is cowardice," Cedric said. It is mercy. They drank. Then Cedric began humming a tune Garrick had apparently loved. Several villagers groaned. "That song has 17 verses," Edric said. 23 if sung badly," Cedric replied. Then Garrick knew 30. The first verse began anyway, low and rough, about a farmer who mistook a bishop's horse for his own. By the second verse, more voices joined. By the third, people were laughing. By the fourth, nobody was sure the story made sense, but everyone agreed. Sense had probably never been invited. Aldrin listened, smiling through the ache in his chest. This, he realized, was how the village held loss. Not by hiding it, not by drowning it, by setting it among laughter, food, candlelight, and familiar voices until grief remembered. It was not alone. Eleanor caught his eye and gave the smallest nod, as if to say, yes, exactly. The song finally collapsed somewhere around the 7th verse, when Thomas forgot whether the bishop's horse had become mayor or married a goat. "Both versions exist," Cedric insisted. "They should not," Mara said. The knight accepted this disagreement peacefully. Afterward, Aldrin spoke. "My father once told me a man should never buy a cart he could not lift." Rowan frowned. "That is terrible advice." He had just been cheated by a cart seller. Wisdom by injury. He spent the next week telling everyone carts were prideful objects. Mara laughed. "I remember that. He kicked one wheel and limped for 3 days." Aldrin smiled, and this time the memory did not hurt quite so sharply. More stories followed. His mother trading herbs for wool. His father falling asleep during a sermon and loudly agreeing with a point no one had made. His mother teaching half the village which plants soothed burns, stings, coughs, and foolish husbands. "Did she have a cure for those?" Thomas asked. "No," Eleanor said, "but she had patience and a wooden spoon." Fearsome medicine. Aldrin felt warmth spread through him. The dead were not restored, of course not, but they were nearer now than they had been an hour before, carried back by voices that remembered them kindly. Above, the stars shone clear and patient. Around him, cups lowered. Hands rested, shoulders eased. The village had made a place for absence without letting it become emptiness. That seemed to Aldrin a rare and tender art. When the final toast was offered, no one spoke loudly. Rowan simply raised his cup once more, and everyone understood. Aldrin lifted his, too, for Garrick, for his parents, for all those whose footsteps no longer sounded on the lane, yet whose stories still warmed the night. The cups tipped. The silence afterward was soft, and in that silence Aldrin felt something inside him loosen at last, like a knot patiently untied by familiar hands. The silence after the toast did not last long. Quiet respect, yes, but not gloom. This village had never been skilled at staying solemn once Thomas was nearby, and Cedric still had a cart full of suspicious objects. Also, Edric's new brass bell kept making tiny sounds whenever he moved, which made him seem less like an ancient shepherd and more like a very serious goat. Mara noticed first. "Edric, are you ringing?" "No." The bell gave a delicate little chime. Everyone looked at him. He frowned at the traitorous object. "It is testing the air." "That is not a thing bells do," Thomas said. "It is now." Before anyone could argue further, a broad man with flour on one sleeve and a grin far too pleased with itself stepped into the candlelight. Ben the miller. Aldrin remembered him as a young apprentice forever covered in grain dust, always looking as if he had recently lost an argument with a sack. Time had thickened him, widened his shoulders, and left him with the permanent expression of a man who had heard every possible complaint about flour and survived anyway. Well, Ben said, if we are speaking of things that should not happen, someone ought to tell Aldrin why Thomas avoids my mill. Thomas immediately sat straighter. That story is exaggerated. Ben smiled. It is not exaggerated enough. The villagers leaned in. Clearly, this was beloved territory. Aldrin glanced at Thomas. Should I be worried? Only for truth. Ben rubbed his hands together. It began with a missing sack of barley. Thomas groaned. Oh, here we go. The miller explained that one spring morning, years earlier, Thomas had brought grain to be milled. The mill was busy, the wheel turning, flour dust floating everywhere like pale mist that had given up on being mysterious and chosen mess instead. Ben had weighed the sacks carefully. 3 sacks went in, 2 sacks, and 1 smaller bundle came out. Thomas, noticing the difference, declared with great seriousness that the mill had eaten his barley. The mill? Aldrin asked. The mill, Ben said. Not me, not mice, the building. I was speaking metaphorically, Thomas muttered. You accused a structure of theft. That is a metaphor with architecture, Ben continued. Thomas insisted the missing grain must have slipped into some hidden place among the stones. He poked around behind barrels, peered into corners, and even tapped the mill wall as if expecting it to confess. Unfortunately, while doing so, he leaned against a flower shoot that had not been fastened properly. The chute swung loose. A cloud of flour burst out, and Thomas vanished, not permanently, of course. But for several dramatic seconds, there was only a white shape standing in the mill, blinking through flour-dusted lashes, looking like a ghost who had been badly needed. The village had heard the shout from the road. Ben wiped his eyes, already laughing. I asked whether the mill had returned him as payment. Thomas pointed at him. And that was rude. It was accurate. By the time Thomas stumbled outside, coated from hair to boots, 3 children had seen him and run through the village announcing that a flower spirit had risen from the mill pond. Within half an hour, people arrived carrying buckets, prayers, and 1 onion. Aldrin blinked. Why an onion? No one knows, Mara said, but it felt important at the time. Here was the eccentric little truth Ben added. Some millers once kept carved marks or charms near millstones, not because stones were magical, but because mills were dangerous, noisy, and unpredictable places. When wood creaked, gears groaned, and flour dust floated thick enough to make breathing feel like chewing. A charm on the beam probably seemed like sensible insurance. People will trust almost anything that makes machinery less terrifying, including carved crosses, horseshoes, and apparently onions. The misunderstanding had not ended there. Thomas, desperate to reclaim dignity, declared that he had inspected the mill from within the flour cloud and found signs of imbalance. What signs? Aldrin asked. Flour, Ben said. There was flour everywhere, Thomas protested. It was a mill. That proves nothing. Ben later found the missing barley behind a stack of empty sacks, where Thomas himself had placed it while helping unload. This fact, tragically, became public. From that day on, whenever Thomas entered the mill, Ben asked whether he wished to accuse any beams, barrels, or honest stones before business began. The village roared with laughter. Thomas endured it with heroic suffering. I maintain, he said, that the mill behaved suspiciously. The mill behaved like a mill, Ben replied. Exactly what it wanted you to think. Even Edric smiled, which caused his bell to chime again. That destroyed the circle entirely. For several minutes, no one could speak properly. Mara leaned against Isolde, laughing softly. Cedric clutched his cart as though laughter might knock him over. Rowan wiped his eyes. Aldrin laughed too, harder than he expected. Not because the story was grand, because it belonged to them. It was ridiculous in the precise way shared memories become ridiculous, polished by repetition, improved by timing, and kept alive because everyone knew their role. Ben was the proud teller. Thomas was the wounded hero. Mara was the sharp commentator. Edric was unwilling comic music. Even the onion had become essential, though nobody understood why. When the laughter faded, Thomas lifted his cup with solemn dignity. I was nearly taken by a mill. You were taken by poor balance, Mara said. And flour, Cedric added. And pride, Eleanor said. Thomas sighed. A man cannot survive so many enemies. Ben clapped him on the shoulder. You survived beautifully. Very pale, but beautifully. The joke rolled onward, sparking smaller memories. A cartwheel that escaped downhill and stopped inside a pigsty. A priest whose sandals stuck in spring mud during a blessing. A child who tried to hatch duck eggs under his blanket and learned that warmth and patience were not the only requirements. Each tale was harmless, bright, and ordinary. Aldrin felt the night grow lighter around him. Grief had been honored. Now laughter returned, not as disrespect, but as balance. That, perhaps, was another kind of wisdom. People needed both cups raised in remembrance and stories, foolish enough to shake sadness loose from the ribs. Thomas eventually bowed to the group. I accept your mockery. How generous, Mara said, but I ask only that the story be told accurately. Ben nodded. Of course. The onion was not my idea. A long pause followed. Then Edric's bell chimed, and everyone collapsed again. Aldrin leaned back, smiling into the candlelit dark, and thought that a village's peace was not silence, not perfection, not everyone behaving wisely. Peace was this: people knowing your most embarrassing story and loving you anyway, possibly telling it forever, but lovingly, mostly. After the laughter over Thomas and the allegedly criminal mill had softened into chuckles, Aldrin felt the need to step beyond the glow for a while. Rowan noticed and walked with him. They left the voices behind slowly, not abandoning them, only letting them become part of the background. The village lane narrowed toward the fields, where the last cottages stood with dark roofs and warm windows. Beyond them, moonlight stretched across the grass in pale silver sheets. The night outside the village felt wider, cooler. The air smelled of damp soil, wild thyme, and distant hay. Somewhere in the dark, crickets played their endless tiny instruments, each one apparently convinced it was carrying the whole performance. A bat flickered overhead, quick and silent, like a thought changing its mind. Aldrin and Rowan followed the old footpath past the well, past the orchard, and toward the low meadow. Neither spoke at first. The quiet was too good to waste. Moonlight lay over the fields, catching on the tips of wheat and turning the familiar land strange without making it frightening. The hedgerows became soft black lines. The trees stood patiently, their leaves whispering whenever the breeze passed through. Aldrin breathed deeply. I forgot how peaceful this path was. Rowan smiled. You were usually running down it. That was different. You were usually being chased. Also different. By geese, once. I had reasons. The geese had better ones. Aldrin accepted this with dignity, which is what a man does when history is clearly against him. They walked on. At the edge of the meadow, Rowan stopped beside a narrow stream. The water moved gently over stones, catching bits of moonlight and breaking them into trembling pieces. Aldrin crouched and touched the surface. Cold, clear, alive in the quietest possible way. In many villages, streams were treated almost like neighbors. People knew their moods, their dangerous banks, their generous bends, the places where children could splash, and the places where wheels might sink. Some old customs even advised greeting running water before crossing at night, not because the water needed manners, exactly, but because people did. A greeting slowed the step. A slower step meant fewer broken ankles. Superstition, very often, was practical advice wearing a dramatic hat. Rowan stepped across first. Aldrin followed. On the far side, the land lifted gently. From the top of the rise, they could see the whole village below. Small lights clustered together beneath the vast sky, smoke trailing faintly upward, voices barely audible now. From that distance, the gathering seemed fragile. A handful of candles, a few dozen lives, a brief warmth against centuries of cold night, and yet it did not feel weak. It felt precious. Aldrin stood very still. "There it is," Rowan said. "What?" "The view you always wanted to leave." Aldrin looked at him, then back at the village. As a boy, he had stood on this same rise, imagining roads beyond roads, cities, castles, mountains, seas. The village below had seemed too small to hold him. Now, after years of distance, it seemed large in ways he had not known how to measure. It held names, losses, births, songs, bread left at doors, embarrassing mill stories, candles saved for dark nights, all the quiet things maps never showed. "I thought small meant simple," Aldrin said. Rowan nodded. "It rarely does." A fox crossed the lower field, its body a shadow slipping between moonlit grasses. It paused once, looked toward the two men, then continued as though unimpressed by human reflection. Fair enough. The moon climbed higher. Aldrin remembered something his father had once told him while sharpening a scythe outside their cottage. A field looks empty until you know what was planted there. At the time, he had thought it was farming advice. Now, he was less certain. The men continued walking along the ridge, where wildflowers had closed for the night and the grass brushed softly against their boots. Every sound seemed clear. Water over stone, leaves shifting, an owl calling once from the wood, the distant murmur of villagers still awake. Peace, Aldrin realized, was not the absence of sound. It was sound without threat, a calm world breathing around you. They reached an old boundary stone, half sunk into the earth. Aldrin remembered climbing on it as a child and pretending it was a throne. A ship, a mountain, and once, tragically, a dragon egg. Rowan tapped it with his boot. Still here, more reliable than most kings, and less expensive. They sat beside it. For a while, they watched the stars. Without city brightness, the sky opened in astonishing depth. The Milky Way stretched faintly overhead, like spilled flour across dark cloth, which made Aldrin think of Thomas. And he had to press his lips together to keep from laughing. "What?" Rowan asked. "Nothing. You thought of the mill." "I did. Understandable." The two friends laughed quietly, careful not to disturb the night too much, as if the stars might complain. Aldrin leaned back on his hands. "When I was away, I believed I was collecting stories." "You were?" "Yes, but tonight, I wonder whether stories were collecting me." Rowan considered this. "That sounds like something Cedric would say before selling you a cracked bowl." "Probably, but it may still be true." The breeze moved through the grass. Aldrin felt the evening settle deeper into him, not as excitement, not as revelation, but as recognition. He had spent so long searching for wonder in unfamiliar places that he had nearly forgotten how much wonder lived in returning with changed eyes. Below them, the village lights flickered. One by one, a few candles disappeared as families went inside, children were carried to beds, and old knees declared peace talks with sleep. Still, the heart of the gathering glowed on. Aldrin knew they would return soon. There were more stories waiting, more voices, more warmth. But for this moment, the moonlit fields held them gently, and the quiet beyond the village seemed not empty, but full of crickets, water, grass, memory, the kind of silence that did not ask anything from a man except that he notice it. And Aldrin did. He noticed the silver on the stream, the dark line of the wood, the soft breath of wind across the meadow, and the small cluster of lights below, where people remembered him, teased him, fed him, and made room for him without ceremony. For the first time in many years, the road ahead did not feel like an escape. It felt like a choice. And tonight, under the patient moon, he chose to walk back slowly. When Aldrin and Rowan returned from the moonlit fields, the village gathering had grown quieter, not empty, not finished, just softened, like embers after flames have done their lively work. The candles still burned in their clay cups, though some had shortened into pools of shining wax. Cedric's donkey had folded its legs beneath itself and appeared to be meditating on the many disappointments of trade. Children who had once ruled imaginary kingdoms now slept against cloaks, baskets, and any adult foolish enough to sit still for too long. The village had entered that late hour when everyone spoke more slowly, as though the night itself were asking for gentleness. Aldrin settled again beside the others. Mara handed him a cup without comment. "What is it?" he asked. "Warm cider." "Bless you." "I know." The cider smelled of apples, cinnamon bark, and a faint smoky sweetness. It warmed his hands before it warmed his throat, and both were welcome. Thomas was speaking softly with Ben the miller, apparently negotiating the official version of the flour incident for future generations. "I only ask for fairness," Thomas said. "You accused a mill of theft. A troubled mill. A mill with witnesses. Hostile witnesses." Ben patted his shoulder. "History will be kind." "History has already betrayed me." Aldrin smiled into his cup. Then, from beyond the cottages, the church bell sounded. One deep note, then another. The village listened without deciding to. The bell marked the late hour before midnight, its tone rolling across roofs, lanes, gardens, and fields, touching everything equally. Even Cedric's donkey lifted one ear, which was perhaps the highest form of respect it offered any institution. The sound faded slowly. Aldrin felt it in his chest after it had left the air. Medieval bells did more than tell time. They warned of fire, called people to prayer, marked deaths, weddings, storms, feasts, and danger. Some villages even believed bells could trouble evil spirits or calm thunder, which was quite a workload for a piece of metal hanging in a tower. Honestly, by that standard, most bells deserved better housing and perhaps a small vacation. Isolde crossed herself lightly. Edric glanced toward the church roof beyond the lane. "Bell sounds clear tonight." Ben nodded. "New rope helped." "About time," Mara said. "Last month it sounded like a cow falling into a cupboard." No one knew exactly what that would sound like, but everyone understood. The bell had changed the shape of the evening. Conversations did not stop, but they sank inward. People leaned closer. Voices became lower. The jokes remained, though now they moved carefully, like cats crossing shelves full of pottery. Aldrin noticed Rowan watching the candle flames. "What are you thinking?" he asked. Rowan took a moment. "That midnight always seemed far away when we were young." Aldrin smiled. "Everything did. Winter, marriage, age." Sore knees. Sore knees arrived faster than expected. With enthusiasm, they drank quietly. Around them, others had slipped into their own reflections. Cedric tied his remaining goods with slower hands. Mara wrapped leftover bread. Eleanor tucked her shawl around a sleeping child whose parents were helping gather cups. Edric polished his tiny bell with his sleeve while pretending not to care for it. The church bell rang once more, a final low note. After it faded, the night seemed larger. Aldrin remembered hearing that bell as a boy while lying awake in bed, counting its notes and imagining the tower as the highest point in the world. Back then, midnight felt mysterious, almost forbidden, a borderland belonging to owls, spirits, thieves, and adults who had no sensible bedtime. Now it felt different, less like a boundary, more like a reminder. The day had passed. Another would come. Whatever had been spoken tonight now belonged to memory. Thomas leaned back with a sigh. There is a strange honesty after bells. Mara looked at him. That was nearly wise. I regret it already. Understandable. But he was right. After the bell, people seemed willing to say what daylight often crowded aside. Ben admitted he worried about the mill wheel needing repair before winter. Isolde confessed she had been saving wax too carefully and would bring more candles to the next gathering. Cedric, with surprising quietness, said the roads felt longer each year. No one mocked him. Even merchants were allowed a human moment occasionally. Edric stared toward the dark hills. I keep thinking of taking fewer sheep up high. That would be sensible, Mara said. I dislike sensible. It dislikes you too. He grunted, but not unhappily. Aldrin found himself speaking before he had planned to. I used to think coming home would feel like defeat. The circle turned gently toward him, not sharply. No one pounced on the confession. They simply made room for it. He continued. I thought if I returned, it meant the road had beaten me, or that I had failed to become whatever I imagined I was supposed to become. Rowan listened, expression calm. Aldrin looked at the candles. But tonight I wonder whether returning is not the opposite of leaving. Maybe it is part of the same road. Eleanor smiled faintly. There, that is better than foolishness. High praise, Thomas whispered. It is, Aldrin said. The group sat with that for a while. Outside the candlelight, the village slept more deeply. A shutter creaked. A horse shifted in its stall. Somewhere, water dripped steadily from a roof edge into a barrel, each drop sounding clear in the quiet. Mara broke a loaf and passed pieces around. For the road and the return, she said. Everyone took a small piece, no grand ceremony, just bread shared beneath fading candles after the bell before midnight. Aldrin ate slowly. The bread was simple, slightly chewy, touched by smoke from the oven. Perfect. He thought of all the meals he had taken alone beside roads, in barns, beneath hedges, outside closed gates. Many had kept him alive. Few had made him feel held. This did the hour, drew everyone closer to sleep, but not yet. There was still one more tale in the air. Aldrin could feel it. The village could too. A quiet expectancy gathered as cups lowered and hands folded. The oldest storyteller had not yet spoken. And before midnight fully claimed the night, everyone turned toward him, waiting for the final story to rise gently from the hush. The oldest storyteller did not hurry. He never did. Time for him had long ago stopped behaving like something to chase. It had become something to sit beside, like a patient animal that no longer needed convincing. He adjusted his cloak slowly, as though each fold had its own opinion about where it should rest. The village waited without pressing him. Even Cedric's donkey, which had endured a great deal of nonsense that evening, seemed to understand this was not the moment for interruptions. Aldrin noticed how still everything had become. Not silent, still. The difference mattered. Finally, the storyteller spoke. His voice was soft, worn smooth by years of use rather than weakened by them. "You all remember," he said, "the year of the long frost." Several heads nodded. It was not a question. Everyone remembered. That winter had not been the worst in living memory, but it had been the most stubborn. It arrived early, stayed too long, and refused every polite suggestion that it might consider leaving. The ground had frozen hard enough to ring like stone. Streams had slowed into glass. Even breath felt like something borrowed and quickly returned. The storyteller continued. "There was a village like ours, not far from here, smaller, quieter. They thought they would manage, as villages always do." Aldrin leaned slightly forward. Something in the tone had changed. Not dark, just deeper. "In that village," the old man said, "the wood stores were not enough. The grain ran low. The paths were too icy for carts. For a while, people began to wonder whether they had prepared badly or simply been unlucky." Mara folded her hands in her lap. Edric's expression remained unreadable. Rowan listened without blinking, but the storyteller said, "They had one advantage." He paused. The pause itself felt deliberate, like a door left open just long enough for attention to pass through. They knew each other. A quiet murmur moved through the circle. "They did not have much," he continued, "but they did not forget how to share what little they had. One house kept extra grain. Another had a stored barrel of dried apples. Someone else had warm blankets they did not truly need yet." Cedric shifted slightly, as though remembering every blanket he had ever sold and whether any of them had been warm enough. "And so," the storyteller said, "they made a decision. No one would hoard alone. Everything would be counted together." Aldrin could picture it easily. Doors opening, hands passing sacks, quiet agreements made without ceremony. "In the hardest week," the old man continued, "when the frost had made even speaking feel like effort, they began something simple. Each evening, one house would keep its fire burning a little longer, not for warmth alone, for light, for guidance, so no one would walk home to darkness that felt like judgment." Eleanor's eyes softened slightly. "And each night," he said, "someone else would bring something small, a cup of broth, a piece of bread, a story told by the fire before sleep. Nothing that solved the winter, but enough to remind them that winter was not the only thing happening." The storyteller looked around the circle. "And they learned something." He did not rush the words. "That survival is not only a matter of strength, it is a matter of not being alone while you are strong or weak." The firelight flickered across faces. Aldrin felt the truth of it settle into the space between his ribs. The old man continued. "When spring finally came, it did not arrive all at once. It crept in. A thaw here, a soft patch of ground there. A bird returning before it was certain it was welcome." A faint smile crossed his face. "And when the village realized the frost had truly gone, they did not celebrate as if they had defeated it." He leaned forward slightly. "They celebrated as if they had endured it together." Silence followed, not heavy, complete. Even the wind seemed to pause just outside the circle of light. The storyteller's gaze drifted briefly across them. "And that is all," he said simply. "That is the tale. No embellishment. No grand moral declared. Just the shape of a memory passed from one set of hands to another." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Thomas exhaled. "Well," he said quietly, "that was inconveniently wise." Mara nudged him with her elbow. "Try not to ruin it." "I am not ruining it. I am respecting it sarcastically." "That is still ruining it." Cedric cleared his throat. "I sell blankets," he said, "if anyone wishes to prepare for philosophical winters." That earned a soft ripple of laughter, gentle enough not to break the mood. Edric looked toward the dark beyond the village. "The frost always returns," he said. "Yes," the storyteller replied, "and people forget." "Yes," Edric nodded once. "That is the problem." Rowan glanced at Aldrin. "And the answer?" The storyteller smiled faintly. "People do not forget when they keep each other near." The words did not land like instruction. They landed like recognition. Aldrin looked at the small circle of faces around him. Flawed, familiar, warm, some tired, some bright, some quietly grieving, some laughing too easily, all present. The candlelight had grown lower now, wax sinking into itself, flames shrinking gently as if preparing for sleep. The village was nearing midnight. The storyteller shifted in his seat. "And now," he said, "you should go before the bell makes you think too much again." That broke the tension entirely. Thomas stood. "I refuse to be sent away by narrative suggestion." "You are already leaving," Mara said. "I am strategically departing." Cedric began packing the last of his goods. Edric lifted his bell. It chimed softly. "Accident," he muttered. No one believed him. One by one, people rose. Not hurried, not reluctant, just moving with the natural rhythm of an evening reaching its end. Aldrin remained for a moment longer. The storyteller met his eyes. "You were not meant to stay away forever," the old man said gently. Aldrin did not answer immediately. Then he nodded once. "I know." The storyteller looked satisfied, as though no further explanation was required. Aldrin stood. The circle loosened, but did not break. People began drifting toward their homes, lanterns lifting into the dark like small stars, deciding to walk. Rowan walked beside him. Mara fell into step on the other side. Behind them, Thomas argued quietly with Ben about whether flower incidents improve over time. They reached the lane where the cottages stood. The village was almost entirely asleep now. Only a few windows still glowed. Somewhere, a door closed softly. Somewhere else, a cat declared ownership of a roof beam. Aldrin paused. He looked once more at the place where they had all gathered. The candles were nearly gone. Only a few stubborn flames remained, bending low against the night. He thought of frost, of bread, of bells, of stories, of returning. Then he exhaled slowly and walked home with them. The village was fully asleep now, not the kind of sleep that feels sudden or forced, but the slow kind that arrives after a long evening has finally finished telling itself everything it needed to say. Windows had gone dark one by one. Doors were barred. Fires were reduced to glowing embers, carefully guarded beneath ash. Only the stars remained fully awake. Aldrin walked between Rowan and Mara along the narrow lane, their footsteps soft against the packed earth. Somewhere behind them, Thomas was still arguing with Ben about whether flowers should legally count as evidence. The conversation was fading into nonsense and laughter, which meant it was ending properly. The night air had cooled further. It carried the scent of damp wood, extinguished candles, and the faint sweetness of crushed grass. The kind of smell that belongs only to places that have lived through a day and survived it quietly. Rowan slowed near a familiar turning. "This is you," he said. Aldrin looked up. A small cottage stood there, its roof slightly uneven, its shutters worn but steady. A single lantern burned inside, left for him without ceremony. No grand welcome, no announcement, just light waiting in a window that remembered him. "I thought someone else lived here now," Aldrin said. Mara shook her head. "No one wanted it," she said. "Too many memories, too many corners where people kept thinking they heard your mother humming." Aldrin swallowed softly. He stepped closer to the gate. It creaked, familiar in a way that felt older than sound. Rowan placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're staying?" he asked. It was not said as pressure, only as presence. Aldrin looked at the cottage, then at the village beyond it, at the sleeping roofs, at the dark fields beyond, at the thin line of forest where he had once run as a boy, believing the world ended just past the last tree. He thought of roads, of distant places, of the endless sense that something was always just beyond reach. Then he thought of tonight. Bread passed hand to hand, stories shared without ownership, laughter that did not need translation, a bell marking, midnight like a gentle reminder, not a command. He breathed in slowly. "I think," he said, "I already left long enough." Mara smiled. "That is not an answer," Rowan said lightly. "It is the beginning of one." A pause settled between them, comfortable and unhurried. Then Rowan nodded once. "Good," he said, as if that settled something important. Mara stepped back first. "I'll bring you bread tomorrow," she said. "You already did that tonight." "I know. I intend to continue." "That sounds dangerous." "It is. You might become well-fed." Aldrin almost laughed. Rowan turned to go, then hesitated. "You know," he said, "when we were younger, I thought the village would always be here when I needed it. And now, I think I understand it the other way around." Aldrin looked at him. Rowan shrugged slightly. "It's good you're back." Then he walked away, his footsteps disappearing into the lane. Mara followed, giving Aldrin a final glance over her shoulder, soft and approving. In the way only someone who has known you too long can manage. Soon, he was alone. The silence that remained was not empty. It was full of everything that had just happened. Aldrin turned toward the cottage. He pushed the door open. It did not protest. Inside, the air was still. Dust had gathered in quiet places. Furniture sat where it always had. The small hearth waited, patient as ever. The lantern's glow from within painted familiar shapes across the walls. He stepped inside. For a long moment, he did nothing. He simply stood in the center of the room, listening. No distant roads, no crowded taverns, no unfamiliar skies, only the soft settling of an old home, remembering its purpose. Aldrin walked to the hearth and knelt. He touched the cold stone. Then carefully, he added, kindling. Flint struck. A spark. Then another. A small flame took hold, hesitant at first, then steady. Light spread across the room. Not bright, not grand. Enough. He sat back on his heels and watched it grow. Outside, somewhere in the village, a dog barked once, and then decided against continuing. The wind moved gently through the fields. The world did not hurry. Aldrin reached into his pocket. The copper button. Cedric had given him caught the firelight briefly, dull and warm. He turned it once between his fingers, then placed it on the mantel. A small thing, like so many things that had filled this night. He leaned back against the wall and closed his eyes. Not asleep yet, just still. He thought of Edric's frost, of Eleanor's grief cloth, of Mara's bread, of Thomas buried in flour, of Cedric's impossible box, of Rowan by the well, of candles against darkness, of stories that did not need to be grand, to be real. The fire cracked softly. Outside, the village breathed in its sleep, and Aldrin, for the first time in a very long time, did not feel like someone passing through. He felt like someone who had arrived. Not all journeys ended loudly. Some ended like this, with a door closing gently, a fire catching, and a quiet evening becoming home. The night settled deeper. The stars kept watch, and everything at last rested.